In this video, we're going to be starting Chapter 17, which is the blood chapter. Chapter 17 starts a series of 3 chapters that are all about the circulatory system. We got basically 3 components. We've got the blood, we've got the heart, we've got the blood vessels, and so we're starting with blood. First question is, if a sample of blood is centrifuged, 3 layers are going to form. What's in those 3 layers? So this picture from your book shows you the 3 layers that form. The bottom layer is the densest layer within the mixture that is blood. A centrifuge, by the way, is just a device that spins mixtures really, really fast. It separates liquid mixtures based on density. The densest material settled to the outside or the bottom of the tubes. And in the case of blood, the densest part of blood is the red blood cells, otherwise known as erythrocytes. Erythrocytes make up just less than half of a normal blood. Somewhere around 45-ish%, which that percentage happens to be called the hematocrit. Above that, the next most dense layer happens to be the thinnest layer. It's called the buffy coat. There are 2 components to the buffy coat. White blood cells, which are also known as leukocytes, which literally translates as white cells, and then platelets. And then above that, just over half of blood, normally, is plasma. Next, what is the hematocrit? I said that earlier. It's the percentage of blood made up by red blood cells. What percentage should it be? Somewhere between 42 to 47%. Again, it does vary. Men tend to have a higher hematocrit than women. So men are going to be closer to the 46, 47%, women closer to the 42, 43%. Since it can be variable, I kind of just want you to remember about 45-ish% is where hematocrit should be for a normal, healthy person. What is the pH range that blood should be in? Somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. That is a very narrow range, but if you get outside of that, horrible things start to happen really, really fast. List some of the substances that the blood helps to deliver. Essentially everything. So nutrients, that would be some of the glucose that we talked about in the last chapter. Amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. Lipids, ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, which we talked about in the last chapter. Essentially, think about the foods that you eat. You break that down, all those nutrients are getting transported in the bloodstream. Respiratory gases, 2 of them, oxygen that we're trying to get into the body and carbon dioxide that we're trying to get rid of. Wastes, the liquid nitrogenous wastes that are in your body, ammonia is a little bit more toxic and urea is what the ammonia gets converted to. Urea is a little bit less toxic. Hormones, that was everything from chapter 16 that I know you guys are already trying to block out because you hated it, but you need that stuff. You got clotting factors, you've got antibodies and immune chemicals. You've got a whole slew of things that the blood is helping to transport. So it's not just those top 2 things. It's literally everything. If you've got to move something in the body, probably the bloodstream is how you're moving it around. List some of the regulatory functions of blood. So blood does help maintain your normal blood body temperature. Remember that when you get to be too hot, you tend to turn red. That's because you dilate the blood vessels in your dermis so that you can radiate off that excess body heat in the bloodstream. That's your blood helping you maintain your temperature. On the flip side, when you get to be too cold, you constrict the dermal blood vessels so that you can keep the blood closer to your body center. That's helping you maintain that temperature in the bloodstream. Normal pH, you have a series of buffer systems that help you maintain the body's pH as a whole. Also, the blood is going to help with the kidneys to just get rid of acids and bases depending on how you need to do anything. Fluid volume and hormones, those are going to help you regulate things as well. There's others, these are just sort of your highlights. How does blood help to protect a person? If you get a wound, you've got a whole hemostasis process that helps protect against blood loss, so that's protecting against blood loss. A lot of your immune system hangs out here in the blood, and that's protecting you against pathogens, so that's protection, immunity that's happening there. Okay, what is plasma and what are the most abundant plasma solutes? So plasma is the matrix for the connective tissue that is blood. It is a liquid matrix. It is mostly water. However, there is a lot of stuff dissolved in that water. Remember, when you dissolve things in water, those things are called solutes. What are the most abundant plasma solutes? Albumin is the most abundant solute, so it's the one that you have at the highest percentage. Albumin helps to regulate your plasma osmolality, or osmotic pressure if you prefer. There's a bunch of other things that are in there. Basically, if you look down at that list 1 through 8 below, those are your abundant plasma solutes. So all of the following substances are dissolved in plasma. What's the function of each? I just mentioned albumin's the most abundant. Make sure you know that, and it helps with osmotic pressure. Albumin is also what gives your plasma sort of that yellowish tinge that goes onto it. Albumin is essentially the protein that you have in egg white, so that's why I'm showing you this picture right here. And if you've never seen plasma by itself, it looks, I mean, a lot more runny, watery than that, but it looks remarkably like egg white because of that albumin that's in there. Other stuff that's dissolved inside of their globulins, they're also called immune globulins because they play a big old role in immunity. Some of your globulins are just globular proteins, so they just play a role in transport of stuff. Fibrinogen is an inactive form of fibrin that helps with blood clotting, so it plays a role in hemostasis, which is the fancy word for blood clotting or stopping the bleeding. Non-protein nitrogenous substances, that is a big fancy way to say waste that you're transporting, like again, ammonia, urea. Nutrients, we talked about those, glucose, amino acids, blah, blah, blah. Electrolytes, sorry, next slide. Anything that had a little charge on it, sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, magnesium, any of those sorts of things, those are being transported in the bloodstream. Respiratory gases we hit earlier, some of that does dissolve in the plasma, so the plasma helps transport those things. And again, all those hormones from the preceding chapter helps to play around with that. Now, the picture that I'm showing you here, I think most people know you can go out and they call it donate your plasma. You're getting paid for it though, so you're selling your plasma. It's not really donation. When you donate your plasma, keep in mind, your plasma is transporting all of these things. So you could be helping a person that has a clotting disorder. So you can be helping a person with hemophilia, for example. You could be helping a person with immunity. They call that convalescent plasma. So you can be helping a person in that regard. So selling your plasma, you can be helping people because you might have some things in your plasma that other people don't. So keep in mind, plasma, while it is mostly water, it is not just water. Okay, what are the formed elements of blood? I like to call these, like I said on the slide, the chunky bits. These are the things that are floating around in the plasma. Some of the chunky bits are pieces of cells. Some of them are almost sort of kind of cells, and some of them are full functional cells. So the pieces of cells, those are platelets. You can see some of those that have clumped together here. The almost sort of kind of cells, those are red blood cells. They don't have a nucleus anymore. They've kicked out, in fact, most of the cellular organelles, like there's no rough ER, there's no mitochondria, all that stuff's gone. But they still have a plasma membrane and cytoplasm. It's just that all the other organelles are essentially gone. White blood cells, fully functional cells with all the regular organelles that you remember from last semester. All of those are formed elements. We're going to first talk about the erythrocytes. What are they? They are also known as red blood cells. I kind of like that your book kind of describes them as bags of hemoglobin at one point. Again, they've kicked out all of the other cellular machinery, and they really are just little bags of hemoglobin because they have one job and one job only, and that is to transport oxygen. So that's their function, transport oxygen. What is blood viscosity? Viscosity describes how thick or sticky a fluid is. Blood viscosity is therefore how thick blood happens to be. I think you guys have all heard the saying, blood is thicker than water. That is true. It's not a lot thicker than water, but it is thicker than water. What contributes to blood viscosity is hematocrit. The higher a person's hematocrit is, the more viscous their blood is going to be. So assuming that your hematocrit is within that normal range, 42 to 47%, your blood viscosity is going to be nice and normal, and your blood will be traveling like it's supposed to through your blood vessels nice and happy. If your hematocrit gets to be too high, like 60%, your blood viscosity gets to be too high. And now your heart is pumping like tomato paste instead of blood. that's going to make blood clotting way more likely to happen, and that is not okay. So there's a reason why you don't want too many red blood cells. It contributes to more blood viscosity, and more blood viscosity is not okay. Okay, hemoglobin. So I mentioned red blood cells are essentially just bags of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a pigment molecule. It is mostly protein, but then there's this little component to it that's called heme. It's this green disc that you can see at the bottom of the slide. The heme part of hemoglobin has an iron atom right at the center of it. The rest of it, like all these red parts out here, that's globin. So it's heme and globin put together, hence the name hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, that central iron that's in it, that iron can pick up oxygen molecules. That is why hemoglobin is so good at oxygen transport. It's because that iron is really good at attaching to oxygen and then transporting that oxygen around the body. Hematopoiesis is the process of making blood cells. That's all blood cells. There is erythropoiesis, which makes red blood cells, leukopoiesis, which makes white blood cells. So there's different types of hematopoiesis, but we're going to talk first about making your red blood cells. All hematopoiesis starts with the same stem cell, regardless of what the end result is going to be. That stem cell, sometimes called a pluripotent stem cell, it is a hemocytoblast. Hemo means blood, cyto means cell, blast just means stem cell. So this is the stem cell that makes all of your blood. It lives in the bone marrow. It divides by mitosis. When it divides by mitosis, it makes two cells. One of those cells is going to stay a hemocytoblast. The other one is going to start the process of differentiation through differential gene expression, and it's going to become a different type of cell. A committed cell is what it's calling it. If it becomes a proerythroblast, it has decided it is eventually going to be a red blood cell. Okay, so hemocytoblast, the stem cell that makes all blood cells. Now, I'm going to skip some of those intermediate steps here, and I'm going to take you down to reticulocytes. So the proerythroblast is going to become these other early and late erythroblasts, and then a normoblast. The normoblast kicks out the nucleus, and then you end up with this cell that's called a reticulocyte. The reticulocyte is what gets kicked out into circulation. So this is the cell that actually leaves your bone marrow and goes out into the bloodstream. Notice that this cell does still have some of the cellular organelles, like there's still a little bit of ER, endoplasmic reticulum, that's in there. So it's not fully differentiated yet, but it's in the process of getting that way. Let's see. Got a slide for this one right here. Since it looks a little bit different from a standard erythrocyte, we can count how many reticulocytes a person has floating around in their bloodstream. What that would tell us is how fast a person is making their red blood cells. And so it's a good thing to be able to count. It can help us differentiate between different types of anemia that a person might have. All right, so reticulocyte, it's the precursor to a red blood cell. How long does it take? About 2 weeks. What information can the count give you? How fast you're making them? Said that earlier. Why is iron needed to make red blood cells? Well, it's because you need iron to make heme, which is part of hemoglobin. And again, red blood cells are just bags of hemoglobin. So you need iron to make all of your red blood cells. Hypoxia or hypoxic means that a person is not transporting oxygen either to specific places in their body or all around their body. So you can have locational hypoxia or you can have systemic hypoxia. For example, people who have Raynaud's phenomena or Raynaud's syndrome, they will have constriction in the capillaries in their extremities, like their fingers. That's locational hypoxia, where their fingers will become hypoxic, but, you know, their legs are fine. Systemic hypoxia is something that you could see in a person who has congestive heart failure, where their lungs are starting to essentially drown in a person's own fluids, so they're not getting oxygen into the body. So all the cells in the body are starting to be deprived of oxygen. If a person becomes hypoxic, the kidneys are going to sense that, And the kidneys are going to start to churn out more erythropoietin so you can make more red blood cells, so you can transport more oxygen. So that's your body's way of trying to fix your hypoxia problem. Now that might help you if your problem was you weren't transporting enough oxygen. It's not going to help you if your problem was you had constricted some of your blood vessels or you were drowning in your own fluids. But it's still your body's way of trying to fix your hypoxia. What are some of the factors that are going to trigger the release of EPO? Again, basically hypoxia in a nutshell, but there are several different reasons why a person might be hypoxic. So, reduced number of red blood cells. So if you have been bleeding excessively for whatever reason and your red blood cells are no longer in you, you're going to be hypoxic because you're not transporting anything. This is actually our best case scenario. If you have been hemorrhaging and so you don't have red blood cells, it makes sense to make EPO to replace your lost red blood cells. This is going to fix your problem. Same for the red blood cell destruction. Let's say your spleen becomes enlarged and inflamed, so you're destroying your red blood cells too fast. Making more red blood cells can help solve that problem, although we do also need to deal with that spleen inflammation. Now, insufficient hemoglobin per red blood cell. Making more red blood cells is not really going to help with that unless you also solve the insufficient hemoglobin problem. Reduced availability of oxygen, as might occur at high altitudes or during pneumonia. At high altitudes, if you make more red blood cells, having the ability to pick up more oxygen from the environment by having more red blood cells, that can actually be very helpful. During pneumonia, maybe not more helpful though. So it kind of depends on why you're hypoxic, whether or not that additional EPO might actually be helpful for you. Let's see, trigger release. What are some of the dangers of having too many red blood cells? This throws back to that whole blood viscosity that I mentioned earlier. Oh, I did actually want to go ahead and mention this right here. Dialysis is something we'll talk about in a lot more detail in a later chapter. Dialysis is something that a person goes through if their kidneys are failing, and the machine that carries out dialysis is actually way more efficient than your kidneys are. In fact, it is too efficient. Your kidneys actually put your hormones back so they stay in your system for longer. The machine doesn't do that as well, so a person who's on dialysis, they will actually lose a lot of their hormones faster than they would have had their kidneys worked better. And so people on dialysis can often become anemic because the machine is filtering out their EPO. And so you will often have to give them some EPO to counteract the anemia because the machine filtered it out for them. So we can treat it, but it's something that you got to notice is happening. Okay. Sort of said this already, but again, the danger of too many red blood cells is excess blood viscosity. When your blood is too thick, it can make your blood clot more easily. And blood clotting, that's what leads to heart attacks and strokes and pulmonary embolisms and DVTs and all those problems that are associated with blood clots. And so it is not okay to have too many red blood cells. When red blood cells have reached the end of their useful life, what will happen to the hemoglobin? Your book has this picture to describe it, and I already have another video up that describes that, and so we should be okay with that already. Just watch that other video. Which organ helps destroy red blood cells that are past their prime? The spleen. I like that your book actually calls it the red blood cell graveyard. All right. Anemia. What's important for you guys to understand about anemia is, like the book says, it is a symptom of a problem. It is not a disease in and of itself. Anemia means that your blood is not carrying oxygen very well. There are lots of reasons why a person might be anemic. And it is very important that you figure out exactly why a person is anemic, because you have to treat the actual reason. You cannot just guess what the problem is. The symptoms that tend to go along with anemia are the person's going to be tired. If you're not transporting oxygen, you can't burn your fuels very well, and so your cells don't have the energy necessary to do everything that the cells are supposed to be able to do. That's why the fatigue, the pallor, the shortness of the breath. The chills are something that people tend to complain about a lot. They feel cold all the time. So all of those are symptoms of anemia. Okay, different reasons. If a person has been bleeding a lot, they will be anemic because, again, if your blood is not inside of you, it is not transporting oxygen very well. We can treat this with blood transfusions. Hemolytic anemia is you are breaking your blood down faster than you are producing it. This can happen, like it says up there, if you have an infection that's enlarging or inflaming the spleen will kill your cells faster than you are producing them. So we've got to treat the infection so that you stop killing them faster than you're making them, essentially. Aplastic anemia means your bone marrow is not churning them out fast enough. Like I say on the slide, and this is a very important one, when you give a person chemotherapy for cancer, you are trying to kill the cancer. And sort of the hallmark of that is you're trying to kill their cells that are dividing fast. Well, your bone marrow divides fast so that you can make more blood cells. And so chemotherapy also damages your bone marrow. So aplastic anemia is one of the very common side effects of chemotherapy. This one is a lot harder for us to treat, but it's one of the reasons why cancer patients will very often end up needing bone marrow transplants. Iron deficiency anemia is one of the more, I never close parentheses. I always see that on the slide and I just never close them. It's so annoying to me. I'll put, y'all can see, another drinking game for you guys. Take a drink every time I don't close a parentheses. Anyway, this is the most common form of anemia. It is far more common in women than men. Twofold reason for that. One, menstrual loss. Two, we tend to not eat as much iron despite the fact that we need more iron, so it's sort of a compounding problem there. Fairly easy to fix. There are iron supplements out on the market, or you could just try to eat more iron in your diet. But again, more common in women than men. Pernicious anemia. So this is a convoluted little process that's going to come back to us in multiple chapters. Vitamin B12 is one of our water-soluble vitamins that most people get plenty of during the course of a day. The only people who tend to struggle getting enough vitamin B12 are strict vegans. And even they can get enough if they are managing their diet well. The thing about vitamin B12 is despite the fact that it's water soluble, it needs help getting across your intestinal membrane by a molecule that's called intrinsic factor. If a person does not make intrinsic factor, they cannot absorb vitamin B12. So pernicious anemia can occur either because a person is not getting enough B12 in their diet, or because they do not make intrinsic factor and therefore they cannot absorb B12 even though their diet is supplying them with plenty of that. If that is the case, we can do injectable B12 and that can fix this problem. Sickle cell anemia is a straight up genetic condition that is more common in people of African descent. There is a malarial advantage for people who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, which is why it's more common in people of African descent. That's a whole convoluted other story. We don't really have time to talk about the genetics at play there. But essentially what happens in people who have sickle cell anemia is whenever they are exercising or they are under stress, the red blood cells will unload oxygen and then take on this characteristic sickle shape that you're seeing in both the GIF and the picture. When they take on that shape, the cell loses their flexibility, and so they don't bend like they are supposed to. And so they tend to dam up the blood vessels and plug them so that blood no longer flows past the point where a plug has formed. That means it's almost like a clot has formed, although instead of a clot, it's damming of all of these sickled red blood cells that has developed that is preventing blood from moving past a certain point. That can lead to tissue death. That tissue death causes major pain. So a person with sickle cell anemia, they can go sometimes years with no problems, and then they will have what they typically call a flare-up, where they will be doing something and then have this extreme pain, and it's because blood is not getting to areas of their body anymore. Transfusions are typically how we treat this. Gene therapy is on the verge of curing this. We are really close, and so hopefully soon this is going to be a thing of the past. I'm super hopeful for that. Polycythemia is the exact opposite of anemia. Now we have way too many red blood cells, not too few, and so our blood viscosity is too high. Polycythemia can be, it's kind of a blood cancer in all honesty. Your bone marrow is churning out way too many red blood cells, and so your hematocrit and your blood viscosity is too high. But it can also be person is blood doping, and as a result they have artificial polycythemia. So sometimes it's a cancer thing. Sometimes it is a blood doping thing, variable reasons. That's where I'm going to stop this video because after this, we start leukocytes.